forward to your humbling and active participation all the way to the last day. Welcome once again to the event.
Fantastic. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Mr. Moses. We totally appreciate that opening remark. I love what Tansue said. Like Bruce Lee actually stated, be water. All right? That is fantastic. Actually, when you are water, you can be able to just pass through and navigate even through the rocks and whatever it is. It doesn't matter what challenge you're going through, but just be water. Fantastic. So we want to get into a very interesting panel discussion, and we have an amazing panelist that has been lined up just for you. And I'd like to just call them out quickly. And our first panelist, this is Dr. Bright Maduwuor. He is the head of Cybersecurity Dimension Data East Africa. Welcome, Dr. Welcome, Dr. Bright. We are glad to have you. And I still remember there's a time Dr. Bright was having a session and he was able to hack into the Wi-Fi of the hotel. So I believe that even the CIA must be looking for him. So thank you so much, Dr. Bright. We're glad to have you. And we have the Associate Director, Cybersecurity, Privacy and Trusted Technology. This is a man with a mighty title, a personal friend and someone that I know well. This is none other than Anthony Muyuiro. Welcome so much, Anthony. And we also have the CIO of Triple OK Law. This is none other than the gamer himself, Mr. Micheal Michie. Welcome also on board, Michael. And I like the hairstyle. If it wasn't for my receding hairline, then definitely I would take that up. And also we have the founder and the CEO of Nyimbi. This is none other than Mr. Nyimbi Odero. One thing I like about Nyimbi is that he starts a company and he calls it his own name. Talk about leaving a legacy. And this is a panel where we're going to be discussing about data privacy and security. And to moderate this particular session, he is the head of partnerships and also a consultant. This is none other than Mr. Humphrey Odhiambo. So welcome on board, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, Humphrey, and take it over from there. And we look forward to an exciting and engaging panel discussion. Welcome to the Actual Convention 2020. My name is Ian Muyuiro.
This is an important announcement to every delegate participating at this year's Actuarial Society of Kenya Convention. As you purpose to virtually attend every session, allow us to indulge you a bit on what is on the menu in terms of panel discussions. The chair of the Task Convention, Elias Amondi, is the moderator for the topic titled Safari Simplified Solvency II. Sylvian Zawu, who is the Group Actuary, Madison Group Kenya, is the moderator for the topic titled Actuarial Qualification Journey. Weavem Bakaya, who is the founder of Sarami Limited, is the moderator for the topic titled Data Privacy Security. These, and other presentations, are available to you during this event. If you can attend most of the sessions as a delegate, the benefits are truly immense, and we look forward to your humbling and active participation all the way to the last day. Welcome once again to the event.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this very important session and the first panel of the day. which is digital privacy and security. These are really delicate times, and at the same time, we are talking about actuarials plunging into the digital space. Indeed, technology is what has proven to be the turning point of how we can deliver from now into the future. And indeed, a very well-themed event in relation to the navigation of crisis. Going forward, we can not only pursue to do better in the space of technology if all who have trained within this space of actuarial cannot also flow with the tandem that relates to digitization and so digital privacy, and at the same aspect, security that comes with it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm privileged to be joined by Nyimbi Odero, Dr. Muyuiro, and Micheal Michie, as well as Anthony Muyuiro. They all actually have the chance to introduce themselves during this conversation that I'm having. So I'll plunge straight up to the discussion by asking, first of all, Mr. Nyimbi. I beg your pardon, I'll go first of all to Anthony Muyuiro. Now that we have a law that relates to data protection, what are the important areas to take note of on the data protection law? Anthony, please. But before you go for the question, you can just go by introducing yourself, please.
All right. Thank you very much, Humphrey. So my name is Anthony Muyuiro. I lead the cybersecurity practice. So for EY East Africa. So I look after cybersecurity, privacy, and trusted technology. Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure just to share a few insights. Like India, South Africa, you have Poppy, Mauritius, they have their own now US. Cannot protect, you cannot really safeguard data that you don't understand. So you need to entirely understand what kind of data do we collect. Because the law is very clear on the kind of data that would actually fall under that category that needs that. now three broad categories. You now have the data subjects, you have now the data controller, and also data processor that can actually be yourselves. But now data subjects, they now have rights to request for this data if they want it to be tweaked or corrected. The law is actually now very clear that data subject rights are supposed to be, it's not really optional, but you need to make sure that you have the mechanisms just to address that. We also look at breach notifications, and this is very important because, again, you'll see that the law has some implied fines. If at all you're not compliant, then it would actually, the organization might be fined in that regard. So it's very clear to have clarity on what the detailed requirements are. But most importantly is just to understand, especially for organizations that have a multi-jurisdictional presence, you need to understand what are the key principles that you need to apply across board. And in a nutshell, that is it. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anthony. But let me take this back to Mr. Nyimbi. Now that you have actually joined us, I think there was just an issue earlier on for you to plug in, but I'm glad you made all the effort to come on board. Nyimbi, please tell us, from this perspective, we walk around, we move from one place to the other, locations that are varied all the time, and we keep leaving our digital footprint. Now, to that extent, is the element of privacy really protected, in other words? And over and above that, are we really safe if we are moving from Mombasa and having a trail that, yes, taking photos there, maybe leaving our swipes within our hotel and all that? Are we really safe? And is our privacy really protected? Please walk us through, sir.
Okay, I'm hoping you can hear me.
I can hear you, sir. Thank you.
All right. So there are three fundamental things that arise. One, the law establishes that data belongs to the person who originated it. This is a critical insight. There is no longer any doubt as to whose data and to whom that data belongs. So insofar as data processors maintain this recognition and maintain your rights, your privacy is guaranteed insofar as you do not waive your rights to privacy. And unfortunately, that waiver of rights is generally written somewhere in the fine print on paragraph 64. But by and large, this is true. Now, another thing that we need to understand about the law is that the law establishes what is negligence. In essence, it's establishing the lowest possible bar. So that is the lowest bar that you're supposed to be able to maintain. But you're actually expected, as a responsible data handler and processor, to maintain standards above the law. And thirdly, I think it's also important to note that as we've all gone online, it means that more and more of our business and more of our lives is now online, establishes new dependencies, and therefore changes the risk profile that both individuals and corporations now have. I don't want to delve too much into what each of these means, but this new risk profile that has emerged, that is distinct from the material world or human behavior in the wild, as it were, changes everything. The entire business calculus has evolved over the last few months. And this is a key insight that people should take away from this discussion. Thank you, Humphrey.
Thank you so much, Nyimbi, for that very enlightening opening remarks as you joined us. I didn't quite prompt you to say who indeed you are and where you work from, but I guess with the follow-up question, I'll want to ask you to do the same. But allow me, first of all, to ask Dr. Bright Maduwuor just to chime in on the same question in regard to safety of our footprint, of our digital footprint being left all over. Dr. Bright, please.
Hi, so my name is Bright Maduwuor. I currently head the Managed Security Services Division for Dimension Data in Africa, Central Africa. So with the digital footprint right now, currently we leave a lot of information online. I usually say privacy is dead because with a lot of tools that are and integrations that we have currently, anybody can get access to almost anything they want. For example, every time you actually go on Twitter and you actually tweet something, anybody, if you have tweeted that around a particular location, anybody can use open source tools to be able to retrieve every information tweeted around that area. And if your account is open, they can actually get details such as what phone you're using, who do you tweet out about a lot. Do a lot of analysis about you just because of information that is there. So just like as Nyimbi talked about, talking about data processors, data controllers, we need to actually understand who has a right to those data, what the data processor is doing. The data controller obviously giving details as to what they can be done with it in the processing. And just to say, with all the information we have out there, with the way we have our systems are set up right now, privacy is almost dead in my case, even though, I mean, because of the complexity of all the integrations that we have, it's very difficult to separate them right now.
I hear you, Dr. Just a follow-up question, just of the same. What are the risks
Yes.
associated, particularly from organizations in regard to non-compliance?
So there's quite a number of risks to consider. If organizations are not going to comply to some of these regulations and everything, there could be a mandatory closure of operations for that particular organization. The thing is, if they are collected, they're not they're not keeping the right rules and regulations. There could be possible reputational damage because of the company. I mean, reputational damage if it gets leaked. You've seen a lot of organizations have been compromised, and they have, in one way or the other, and people's personal identifiable information has been leaked out, meaning that I could be able to actually sue them because they have not taken the measures to protect my data. So that also becomes an indirect cost to you as the organization if you are not compliant, and that can lead to possible loss of contracts, possible loss of revenue. So that's an indirect cost, and of course credibility. So organizations have to make sure they conform to comply. They have to be compliant and follow the right processes to be able to make sure that everything that they're collecting about their clients are actually being kept very safe.
Thanks, Doc. Michael, you work in an organization that actually manages legal issues quite a bit. Being the CIO of that organization, just tell us more about what you do within this setup, and go further to tell us to what extent do you think that the new data law is enforceable with a specific interest to Kenya, and by extension to the
example you would see with Kenya is the law is heavily borrowed free. That is, we did not factor in how, and by extension, how Safaricom uses in M-Pesa for
detailed accounts and the risks indeed that we are exposed to every other day that we leave our traces, particularly to the organizations that we visit or exit. Anthony, would you kindly like to chime in onto this as well?
All right. Thank you, Humphrey. Absolutely. So basically, the key things that we also need to have, clarity on is that we need to look at the spirit, even of this law, first of all. And this is basically just to protect the end user, and these are the data subject rights, because there has been a lot of you have never walked into a certain store, but they send you SMSs. Possibly this information was possibly even sold to them by somebody that you actually rightfully left either your phone number and your names and all other details there. So that in itself is actually a problem. And the law is supposed, and it's been designed to help, mitigate that issue. So some of the risks that organizations would actually face if they're not really compliant to this is, and I like what Dr. Gameli mentioned earlier, is that, number one, you have reputational risks, but also there are also fines that have been explicitly mentioned. If you're not compliant, then ideally you can be fined. For GDPR, the number is up to 4% of the global turnover, which is quite a significant amount. For Kenya, as per the law, is somewhere like 5 million Kenya shillings. That is also quite an amount, a lot of money, in my view, but also depending on the nature and the size and scale of the organization. So we also need to look at that. There's also the money that you can actually lose, but also, especially on reputational aspects, you can even have instances where people can even take a class action lawsuit against you. And this is something that has a potential of really, eating into your revenues. And especially when you're breached, and in our space where we look at some of these cybersecurity attacks, when they happen, they can actually be very detrimental to your brand. And some of the risks that you also need to be cognizant of, also the regulatory risks that might also be, related to that. Thank you, Humphrey.
Great. Thanks, Anthony, so much. There is this great feeling that, yes, now we have the data commissioner in office, having been vetted very recently, particularly in Kenya, in the parliament. And so we have the structure into place. And I would like to open this to all of our panelists. What do you think would be the immediate next steps now that we have the data commissioner in office? Maybe we could begin with you, Mr. Nyimbi, and you can take now this opportunity to actually introduce yourself further. Then you plunge into it, sir.
Right. My name is Nyimbi Odero. I'm founder and CEO of Nyimbi Inc. We're a global organization. We're now about 5,000 people. We're in the cloud software development business. We buy small failing companies, re-engineer them, turn them around, and make them profitable. I was previous to that a civil servant. Now, diving straight into the subject of the information and data management framework. The law still needs to be fleshed out. It is substantively lacking in many parts, vague in others. It still requires interpretation and testing through the court system, which I'm sure is something that will happen eventually. But I think that the key takeaways are that the supporting regulations that flesh out the law have still not been written. Some of the penalties are unclear, and they will certainly be developed. And absolutely, the role of government in data privacy and data access is still very unclear. While it is true that we do give data to private organizations, it is also true that the government collects our information. And controls and remedies that citizens have over government held data are at best uncertain at this time. And this is certainly something that needs to be explored at some point. The other issue, of course, is, and I would imagine that for an actuary, aggregated statistical information on a population is of interest. So, how does personally identifiable information become aggregated to become statistically meaningful data? How this process of aggregation works, or even if it is allowed, is still something that needs to be established. How do you, in Kenyan law, anonymize data? And how can you test that the data is appropriately anonymized in order to give a statistical corpus that can be used for other purposes? So there's still a way to go. It's a good start, and at least it does establish the primacy of the individual and the ownership of data, which is a significant improvement. Hospitals can no longer hold your records, they must give them to you. This is good. So there's progress, there's a way to go. Thanks, Humphrey.
Sincere gratitude, Mr. Nyimbi, on that detailed account, blow by blow, on what areas should be the immediate next steps. May I open it also to Daktari? You can help us detail it further.
I was part of the people I was part of the engineering team when the Ghana data protection was being done a few years ago. And one of the issues that came up was that it's caught a lot of people off guard is how they actually keep the data safe. Because according to the data protection law, you have to make sure you have to put in some guidance as to how you need to keep people's data safe. So now that we have a commissioner, a lot of organizations are going to high number of policies, about 20 or 25 are needed for every organization who is collecting any data. So the question is, are people even following? Do they know the guidelines? Are people even read the data protection law to know exactly what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do? You have to give proof of data of security ways of how you protect the systems, security engineering. Do you have a security personnel in-house, or are you outsourcing that services? Threat intelligence or threat monitoring. All of those have to be coming. Are going to be coming to a lot of people. So they need to know, or companies need to know that if they're collecting data, they need to start knowing the guidelines they have to follow to make sure the data is safe. Security can't just be cannot be just an everyday activity, but has to be embedded in the entire organizational structure.
Sounds good, Tari. Much appreciated, and more so also for you to be part and parcel of the journey that was ensuring that we can have an effective data commission, well structured for purposes of our country's growth. But then, and again, a question to all the panelists: how does this piece of law compare to the GDPR? Michael, we could begin with you, sir.
Thank you, Humphrey. So I think most of the panel has mentioned this before. Our current law is heavily borrowed from GDPR, of course with a few exemptions, and GDPR was well written for a European market, and I think we should have at least other African countries who haven't yet developed their own laws while developing theirs should not just do the copy-paste formula. They should try a lot to make sure that this law is something which speaks to how they use data, how the country has been using data, issues around data privatization, and other concerns which fit their jurisdiction, because certain elements of GDPR, of course, could not read into our law, so we made changes and amendments. But for the most part, the two laws are quite similar. However, we do encourage that if you're an organization which also has to comply with GDPR and you have to comply with Kenya's Data Protection Act, complying with one does not mean you've automatically complied with the other one.
Anthony, you want to mention something? I'm so certain you are burning something to mention, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a very, very good question because, again, I agree with Michael that most of these other follow-up, data protection and privacy regulations have actually been an extrapolation of GDPR, because when you look at how GDPR constructed, and this actually took them a long time, because even before GDPR, they actually had the Data Protection Act, 1998. So they were well ahead of the curve. So they had the benefit of time just to refine it. And I agree with Mr. Nyimbi here that definitely, yes, we are starting somewhere. It's not perfect, but this is something that we can build as we proceed. So yes, so many similarities to GDPR. In fact, you can argue some of this are just cut and paste, but I do agree as well that you need to also tailor it to be very fit for your environment, because, and I'm working with some organizations who are now, we are working with them the journey towards GDPR compliance, and some of them we also, helping them just to comply to the Kenya Data Protection Act. But the most important thing, and to my earlier point, is you need to really have clarity on the key requirements. And then, of course, now you tailor your privacy policies and all the privacy requirements. And if you want to do a roadmap, you tailor it based on that. If you're, especially for multinationals that ideally maybe you have presence in Europe, you also have presence in Kenya or the rest of Africa and other regions, then ideally you need, as a first place, and the first thing you need to do is just to have clarity on what the requirements are, where they're similar, because GDPR is more mature than ours. You'd find there's some areas that have already been covered, but you need to have clarity on what specifically is being requested locally. And let me just make one last point, that the journey to compliance is a multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder approach. It's not just an IT issue. It's not just the legal and compliance issue. We have seen that you need to bring all these units and all these perspectives to the same place, because there are areas that the legal team will be able to advise. There are areas where you're talking about enforcing secure, mechanisms to make sure security of data. You need the IT guys to advise. When you're talking about matters to do with compliance, and especially where regulatory compliance is involved, you need now the right people to look at that. And of course, the owners of the data are always busy. So you need all these key stakeholders from the different disciplines just to look at that. Thank you, Humphrey.
Sounds very interesting. But we appreciate the fact that you are quickly also highlighting the fact that it is a process before we can perfect it, even as we compare it with the GDPR. I'll be having shortly some questions that are also coming from our delegates. Daktari, I think it should be appropriate also for you, while you are structuring how our law could be, what components do you see are a clear kind of a gap from the GDPR? What comes into context is particularly the punitive aspects if we do not comply. GDPR could be having certain punitive elements compared to our law here. Maybe you can just put us into context what the penalties are like. Doc?
I'm not clear on the exact details, but there are quite a number of fines that will come to you in case you don't comply. Because I think, and then this is a mandate. There's very small things that will be coming out of that compliance, which we need to actually look into. So it's not just to you. I mean, so it will be very. The main component is how exactly you keep that how you have the list of things that you do. Very, very specific, and we need to just have to make sure we have to go through the law properly to make sure that we actually comply to every single part of the regulatory processes. This will involve not just technical people, but also people who are in the legislative aspect of any organization.
Great, Doc. Now, this is a question that comes from one of our delegates and is keen to ask all of us, the panelists, all of us who are here, any one of us can pick it up so that we can have a clarity on this. I thought his clear wordings are, I thought the law recognizes privacy to the extent that data can be used to narrow down on particular individual. Now, do the restrictions also apply to anonymized data? Doc, you'd like to go for this first? Just to open for us the stage. Or the question of anonymity in comparison to the individual. Does it narrow down to an individual ultimately?
I don't think it does narrow down to any individual per se. As you see, like I said, the complexity of how data is being collected right now is almost beyond us for us to be able to narrow down. So, I mean, for example, even going to a building where you're putting down your name, your national ID, and all of those details, that's data being collected. Using mobile applications that collect details about your phone, your details, it's already putting again at risk. I'll give a typical example of a loan app. It's a loan app in one of the loan app in Kenya, who were collecting details of your phone, your SMS records. Every single SMS you've ever sent, they're collecting. They had access to call records. And you say you accepted and you gave them the permission to be able to do that. But they were not following the right guidelines of data protection. So currently, as I speak, the data is online and a public repository that you can go actually read SMSs that people have been exchanging with their loved ones, the PIN numbers that they've been receiving, or which most probably they haven't changed, are also in there. And they're all on the public repository right now. So being able to narrow, I mean, the anonymity of data, that particular loan application or loan company, is an international one actually. So first of all, they violated GDPR. They violated people's data here again in Kenya. And if you look at that, they've not anonymized any data, and it was being leaked out. Not being leaked out, they carelessly let that data out to the public, and anybody, I mean anybody around the world with the right search query can find that data, which belongs to Kenyans. So the anonymity of Kenya is very difficult to narrow down, and they think they're protecting your data, but however, they have all your call logs, all your contact lists, They have every SMS you've ever sent to somebody so far as you have been on that application.
Sounds great, but a very thin line of actually debate on it. Nyimbi, what are your thoughts further when we are coming to the individual, considering, yes, you could be working with an organization, but you are responsible of certain elements, and then ultimately there is a reason really to pin down where did this information come from, or where was the leakage. Would it actually pin to an individual ultimately? You may please.
So personalization, the anonymization of personally identifiable information is a difficult topic, because the ability to triangulate from a piece of data to an individual is dependent, one, on the skill of the person doing the triangulation, two, open public domain, open source, or available data that they can use to do that correlation, and third, the impact that it will have on the person identified. So if, for instance, you were to say something like 49 of people aged between 45 and 47 living in a particular part of Nairobi who have got this particular income, this is the degree of risk that they have. And if that sample population is really small, then it is possible to triangulate with reasonable accuracy to a sufficiently small population that you can identify specific individuals, despite the fact that the data is presented in some statistical aggregation. So while it is true that in the large, statistically aggregated means, average deviations, population characterizations are generally anonymous, there's also a key requirement that the population of people be sufficiently large that one cannot make what in law is called a reasonable presumption of identification. Now, the key takeaway from this is that you've got to be very careful about how you actually do the science, because somebody can work backwards from where you are and say that this is targeted at an individual and therefore causing them significant harm or putting them in a different taxation or insurance or whatever other bracket that causes them perceptual harm. So managing personally identifiable information is not just removing names and ages and geographies. You need to be very careful that the person who does the anonymization is not the person who tests the quality of the anonymization that has been done. And because the consequences for an organization can be particularly dire.
Yes.
Thanks, Humphrey.
Yeah, that's a very interesting bit. And as we are closing, because I have barely 4.5 minutes now, Michael, just some remarks on the same, on anonymity and narrowing down to an individual, particularly while serving in an organization. And I also have in context in this regard the elections in future that we could appreciate, that we are going to have, particularly in Kenya, using the digital platform. Please, if you could make some remarks along those lines as well.
All right, sure. So I think Bright and Nyimbi have said it quite well. it is very difficult to anonymize data because of the kind of tools we have that could then be used to work backwards, reverse, and infer the correct identity. I think it is responsible. It is a responsible act for all organizations, especially when they share data with third-party organizations, to ensure that the data they are sharing is, first of all, just they limit the amount of data. Two, they anonymize where they can. Of course, this is obviously part of the agreement to the election as well. In regards to the elections, well, personally, myself, I don't know how to comment that. I'm not a big fan of political things, so probably someone else in the panel would be better placed to explain just the whole process of data and elections.
Okay. I know Mr. Nyimbi has played a significant role in some of the areas that relate to public data. Maybe you'd like to chime in at this juncture, but our last question, you'll chime in after reading a question from Mr. Arth Shah. Arth, thank you very much for sending your question during this particular session. So Arth is asking, Mr. Shah is asking, speaking of data privacy, if an organization is conducting a survey and is anonymizing who all have participated in the survey and creates a report with the results that will be in public, I assume this is okay, is it not? Is it right? Particularly on the surveys. Anthony, you could begin by telling us about this anonymity, please.
Sure. Thank you, Humphrey. I think that's a good question from Mr. Shah. So on the question, if you do a survey and then you issue out the survey reports, as long as you basically two things, in fact, tied to also anonymity, there's also pseudonymization, which is ideally giving fictitious identifiers, which are not really, like if my name is Tony, and you want to quote me somewhere, you can give it as John or another name and all that. So those two principles would ideally be ideal, and especially when you're issuing out some of this some of this findings to the public domain, as long as you do not really identify the person, not unless there's explicit consent, and that is very key. And that's why when you're doing this survey, part of the survey question should actually be, in fact, one of the key things you need to assure them is that confidentiality is going to be maintained, and these are the measures you're going to take. But where maybe you'd want to quote specifically somebody, you need to get their explicit. And by explicit, we mean it is very clear that this and this is how I'm going to disclose what you actually give it. Some people would actually be okay with that, but lack of it is, of course, it's okay as long as it's anonymous, and you'll ideally, and this is where we call purposeful intention. Purposeful collection of data is a principle enshrined into the law, that it needs to be very clear why you are collecting the data, and you also need to disclose that you're going to issue out the results. And where you are going to anonymize or pseudonymize their identities, you also need to tell them. But where maybe a data subject would not really have an issue, you quoting them or anything, because I've personally been quoted in surveys as well. They normally give me an explicit, where I need to sign off an explicit consent that your name is going to be tied to this, so that if it's anything that you don't want to be, linked with, at least you have the privilege of just giving an option to that. So those are just my key takes on that. So thank you.
I can't hear.
Thank you, Humphrey.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony. There's another question from Jay. Jay, thank you very much for actually being very interactive during this discussion. So what Jay is asking, my dear panel, and indeed he's complimenting you for being such a great panel. And by the way, I've not forgotten Nyimbi in relation to the public data that you've handled before. So I'll give this question by routing it to you. Question from Jay Kosgei. To what extent are Kenyan and regional companies are ready to consider cyber insurance to manage the cyber security and data risks? I think this is very relevant, particularly when it comes to the actuarial society. And indeed, a very good question also as we are winding up this session. Nyimbi, if you could tell us just about how you've handled public data before, not squarely on elections, but that's an area that maybe you've touched on, but if you'd be keen to mention about it, would be happy. Then you put into context Jay's question on the risk management in the insurance.
Okay, thank you, Humphrey. In a previous life, I built election management and vote regulation systems in Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and a couple of other countries in Southern Africa, which was a massive data collection, processing, and securitization effort. It's public data is any data you give to government gets out. I think is a given. There are way too many hands that touch it and way too little regulation. But addressing the issue of cybersecurity risks, what is clear is that in the emerging new order, businesses are built around data infrastructure, which means that it creates new dependencies and new requirements, and therefore also has new impacts on the business, potentially catastrophic. It therefore would seem to me that every business that for catastrophic loss of either reputation, business, or revenue as a consequence of a data breach would really be wise to take up insurance against such a risk. It would seem to me, though I'm not exactly a risk practitioner, it would seem to me that this is about time, particularly given the significant consequences that data breaches, depersonalization, and data loss can have on a business, that insurance is a very good idea. Thank you, Humphrey.
Great. And as we wind up now, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks again for staying put despite the technical hitches that we had at the beginning of this session. I would like just to invite my good panelists to make closing remarks in regard to data privacy in Kenya with the perspective of the actuarials who have actually who are actually serving within our country right now, and also from the context that digitization will play a significant role in ensuring that risk management can be stabilized within organizations that they serve and beyond. So my first panelists who I would call to make these closing remarks within 49 seconds would be Anthony, please.
All right. Thank you very much, Humphrey. And I think this is a very good time for also us just to be very clear, especially, and my take my parting shot is, number one, we need to have clarity and really understand what the law is all about and what's really required, and most importantly, what are these principles that have been underpinned. And there's a question that you earlier mentioned. We cannot talk about compliance if you first do not understand the kind of data that you actually have. So for organizations, the key thing here is also just to understand what kind of data do you have, number one, and then how does this data move in your environment? Because that again will also give you context in terms of how the protection mechanisms you need to have in place, from collection all the way to usage, storage, and if it moves to third parties, you need to understand the kind of third parties that have that. And to my actuarial colleagues, I believe this is a very, very good time also. And I've worked with a few actuarial experts in the insurance space. And where you're talking about modeling some of the products that we in tech need, I think this is an opportune time because we need you as professionals just to be able now to help us. What kind of products do we need to take out there, especially looking at from a privacy perspective? Yes, we have cyber insurance, but I believe there's more to do than just cyber, because cyber is a bit different. Cybersecurity is a bit different from privacy. So I think there's an opportunity there for my actuarial friends just to look at some of the products that can actually be tailored. And then, of course, always engage and share information and knowledge with the rest of us in the industry. Thank you, Humphrey.
Most welcome, sir. And thank you so much, Anthony, for those well-received closing remarks. Micheal Michie, please. What would be a parting shot, particularly at this session that is themed navigating the crisis, targeting the actuarials, and of course, complementing also that they do not work in solitude, but they also work with other partners within the organization, sir?
Thank you, Humphrey. So what I think would be best is, of course, this compliance to any law or regulation does take time, and it's not a journey and it's not sort of a checklist, but I would recommend everybody to start having what we call a data life cycle, figure out from the point of collection, storage, use, transfer of data, who exactly has that data, who's responsible for it at what stage, what third parties get it, why do they get it, what data do you receive as a third party, and why do you get it. Once you've built a data life cycle, it's much easier from there on to start building your ground compliance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Micheal. Daktari, please put into context as your last word, particularly when we are winding up now. Where do we also go from here as actuarials?
So the actuarials are actually going to deal with a lot of data. Data is the new oil. Data is the new data is a new zone of being able to actually manipulate anything and everything, and there are very good results that can come out of it. We are going to collect more data. We're going to actually generate more data. We have to make sure we follow every single process that we have to take to make sure that data is actually kept safe. There will be so many adversaries who are out there, hackers who are out there, with malicious intent to be able to make sure they can steal this data and be able to make it public, which can go against someone or be able to use it for various malicious activities. So my parting shot is like anything you put online is going to be found. Any information that you're actually collecting, just make sure that you can keep it safe. Let that security be something that is embedded from the top, from management all the way to the person who's actually been cleaning the office has to be involved in the data security or data protection. That'll be it for me. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to actually address such a very important topic.
Thank you so much, Daktari. You are always so helpful in this journey. Nyimbi, your parting shot, please, to this great team.
I'll deviate slightly towards just the general subject of risk management. I think that the product development that needs to occur in the future needs to take account of the changing expectations of the marketplace. As people move to the cloud, they get used to a pay-as-you-go and a carefully metered model of utility and use, and the actuarial profession, which makes a presumption of long-term predictability of certain factors, needs to begin to evolve and adapt to look at the ever-fluctuating probability and predictability of the future, and people's expectation that how much they pay is going to actually mirror that particular predictability, which is a constantly evolving magnitude and a constantly evolving value. In which context, the situational awareness that you need to maintain to actually begin to predict risk is going to evolve over time. And some of the fantastic new technologies that are emerging are going to be of particular interest in modeling cyber risk, if you will. And I think it's an exciting time to be in your profession. It's an exciting time to be alive, as we watch the entire world transform around us in the next year or two. It's a wild ride ahead, and I'm sure you folk will enjoy it as much as we all are. Thank you, Humphrey.
Thank you so much, my dear panelists. And I believe also wherever you are watching from, that's in the offices and from your homes, be it in the hotels and wherever you would be joining us from across the world. We really thank you for sparing this special moment just to understand the journey. Key aspect that comes out of this is predictability, and indeed taking data so seriously. Indeed, beyond seeing data from the value of money or monetary, it's emerging that it would be our blood. Data would be, beyond being the oil, be our blood. Signing off from this particular session, and indeed thanking again my panelists for a good job. I salute you all, my dear panelists. And to you, again, I thank you for walking through this step again. Thank you so much, and God bless us all as we get into the next steps. We'll soon have some entertainment also within this particular session. We need to lighten up a bit, other than being just so serious and following what data is. But let's now put that data into some bit of jig. Thank you very much.
CIC Insurance. We keep our...